Brian, thanks very much. I remember actually when I was hired, and Dennis, welcome to you, the obviously first chairman of what was then VicPet, now Senex. And Tim Cromlin said to me, we're using this one, right? Tim Cromlin said to me, Ian, we really need you to stick around for 3 years or so. I went, yep, no worries, Cromo. Here I am 14 years later, so thanks, mate. Brian, thanks very much, and ladies and gentlemen, great to be here. This is the second year in a row I've been here, and it's a great forum, and hopefully today you'll learn a couple of things you might not know about energy. It'll be typically punchy in some of the areas, and I'm looking forward to some questions as well. So I am here to talk about energy and how specifically energy drives prosperity. Why? Energy is how we make things. Energy is how we move things. Energy is how we heat our homes and prepare our food, and energy is prosperity. And given the fact that current governments and some parts of society don't appear to have any regard for history, let alone physics, let's start with a bit of history. The history of world and mankind can be traced alongside our ability to harness and convert energy for productive uses. Over the last century and a half, part of our global population learned how to harness an abundant resource at our feet, known as fossil fuels, and create prosperity the likes of which the world had never seen. But before that time, progress was very, very slow. For centuries, the only sources humans relied on, besides their own labour, were fire and animals, to haul roads, plough fields and draw water from wells. Most of society was involved in agriculture, a labour-intensive task. An acre of wheat took 56 worker hours to farm and produced just 15 bushels. Life for many was fairly simple, but far from prosperous. It wasn't until the early 1600s when burning coal for energy was discovered. By the 1650s, burning coal supplied 2/3 of all heat in the region, now known as the United Kingdom. And around 70 years later came the discovery of natural gas for light and heat. By the early 1700s, coal gave us the first steam engine, the iron workhorse, which powered early industrialisation. The shift to fossil fuels drove the Industrial Revolution. This saw significant changes in agriculture, manufacturing, mining, transportation and technology, and had a profound effect on the standard of living and prosperity. After 1850, energy conversion picked up tempo even further, giving us new energy sources and the start of large-scale globalisation. Crude oil, hydropower and wind turbines, geothermal electricity, nuclear and solar power were discovered and shared. By the 1900s, the global share of fossil fuels, coal and some crude oil, provided half of all primary energy, with traditional fuels such as wood, charcoal and straw, accounting for the other half. Access to abundant and reliable fossil fuels meant a portion of society was prosperous and urbanising, but the other half of the world was living in extreme poverty. By the year 2000, fossil fuels and new technologies had completely dominated energy production, with only the poorest people in low-income countries still reliant on wood and straw. The rise of fossil fuels has seen the number of people living in extreme poverty drop from around half the global population to less than 10%. As we created more energy from more reliable and affordable sources, prosperity grew, and so too did our demand for energy. And that continues to grow today. The abundance of energy has changed every facet of human existence. It has allowed us to work less, eat better, travel more and communicate more efficiently. Plentiful energy has contributed to materially better living standards, increased life expectancy and population growth. For context, The global population grew from 1 billion in 1800 to 1.6 billion in 1900, then to 6.1 billion in 2000, now tipping over 8.1 billion just 24 years later. Total energy consumption has grown in much the same way. On a per capita basis, global energy consumption increased 160% from 28 gigajoules in 1900 to 73 gigajoules in 2000. 20 years after 2000 saw an additional 23% increase, up to approximately 90 gigajoules per capita by 2020. As you may have gleaned from the slide, and Mark, I'm assuming that worked, well done. We were worried about that. Well, I was worried about that, actually, they were very confident. As you may have gleaned from the slide behind me, energy usage is not uniform and dominated still by wealthy countries. We now have unprecedented amounts of energy at our disposal, drastically improving our standard of living, something that so many of us take for granted. Take a look around this room. Nearly everything that is part of our daily lives relies on energy, and more specifically, fossil fuels. The chair you're sitting on, the floor you walked on, the glass you're drinking from, your clothing, the steel in this building and how you travelled here today are all produced in some large way thanks to fossil fuels. Most importantly, the food, the fuel you're eating this morning has been produced using natural gas. In fact, fossil fuels have had a profound impact on food production. They have powered the machinery, transportation and irrigation pumps associated with our food supply chain. And perhaps most importantly, fossil fuels have been used to produce fertilisers and agrochemicals for food production. The UN's Food and Agriculture Organisation estimates the worldwide share of undernourished people globally has decreased from 65% in 1950 to 9% in 2023, while the population has tripled. This is in large part thanks to modern agricultural practices powered and underpinned by fossil fuels. Without fossil fuels, we could not supply 90% of humanity with adequate nutrition. It's hard to underplay just how important ammonia and nitrogen-based, that is nitrogenous fertilisers, produced using natural gas have been to the explosion in productivity of modern agriculture. The average vegetable and wheat crop requires more than 100 kilograms of fertiliser per hectare. Without nitrogenous fertilisers and the gas used to make it, it is no exaggeration to say that billions of people would starve. In fact, half the global population, or some 4 billion souls. The facts are that without efficient, reliable and affordable energy inputs, food production would plummet and prices would rise to exorbitant levels out of reach to most of the global population. So there's the history lesson, and you've been patient, thank you. What about today? Surely things have changed. After all, it's 2024. We're living in an extraordinary time. We're living through a generationally important energy transition. I prefer a complex global energy transformation. The challenge and complexity ahead should not be underestimated, nor should the pathway and energy required to get there. Despite what you might hear or read in the media, the fact is that 90% of our primary energy sources in Australia today still come from fossil fuels, 90%. 40 years ago, that number was 94%. In 40 years, we have reduced by 4%. After more than 3 decades of striving and political manifesting to will the clean energy transition into existence, fossil fuels still deliver the vast majority of primary energy to this country and indeed the world. Now let's talk about electricity generation, and specifically electricity generation on Australia's east coast, which is incredibly important to everyone here. We read about it daily. In respect of generation fuels, on average, and the term on average is actually really important here, and I'll come back to that. Coal supplies 57% of generation fuels, renewables supply 37%, and gas supplies the balance. Again, it's important to labour the term on average because the energy mix includes intermittent generation sources that don't always perform as expected. When the wind doesn't blow, when the sun doesn't shine, water doesn't flow, or indeed coal-fired power station units explode, like we saw at Callide here in Queensland, the energy mix looks very different. These excellent charts, and thanks go to Cooper Energy as I shamelessly stole them from their recent investor presentation, show 1 week in May and the huge variability of wind, solar and hydro. And they show the reliable role that coal and gas in particular play in picking up the load to keep our lights on and our homes warm. The chart at the bottom, and I'll give you a second to look at it, the chart at the bottom shows the national picture. Note the black. The chart at the top shows as a juxtaposition, shows the renewables heavy South Australian position. You can see the reliance of gas in particular shown in that dark red to pick up the load when everything else isn't there. Just last month, the penetration of renewables in the grid fell to 10.2%. And in fact, the entire second quarter saw wind and hydro perform well below expectations, reducing by more than 1,000 megawatts of generation. So this chart takes a little bit to get your eye in. It's a change from Q2 23 to Q2 24. And the area below the zero x-axis is the generation that was there last year that was not there this year for the entire quarter. That's 1,000 megawatts of generation that just disappeared that gets relied upon. And when it disappears, have a guess what's there to fill it? It's natural gas. Despite this underperformance, we continue to see a disproportionate investment in these technologies and efforts to run coal and gas out of the system at an alarming pace. Make no mistake, these energy mainstays play a critical firming role in our system and a role that will be needed well into the future. And gas does much more than generate electricity. Gas is used by 40% of our industrial sector for high heat production and feedstock to make building products, fertilisers and chemicals. Let's consider what a world without fossil fuels would look like. Without fossil fuels, and that includes natural gas, each year the world could not produce the 4.5 billion tonnes of cement for roads and runways, the 1.8 billion tonnes of steel for buildings and cars, the nearly 400 million tonnes of plastics to make hospitals, equipment and sterile packaging, and the 180 million tonnes of ammonia used in fertilisers to grow food and feed our global population. These products enable our modern way of life. Australians and the world needs natural gas, and they're going to need it for a very long time. That's why Senex is in the gas business. We're here for our customers, for manufacturers, for households and everyone in between. While other technologies are advancing, most, are not sufficiently advanced, economically or at scale, to simply walk back from fossil fuels today, or in my view, any time remotely soon. This is a matter of physics, not a matter of politics, nor indeed a matter of fashion. Simply put, fossil fuels, including natural gas, are essential to our standard of living, prosperity as a country, and in the transition to net zero. The essential role of natural gas, not only in the Australian economy, but for our Asian allies and around the world, is undisputed by experts both in Australia and abroad. Wood Mackenzie estimates the global gas demand will peak in 2040 at over 176,000 petajoules of gas. Even the most bearish scenarios, which is on this chart, like the International Energy Agency's net zero emissions scenario, assumes a requirement for over 40,000 petajoules of natural gas globally in 2050. 40,000. For context, a global LNG leader, Australia, produces around 6,000 petajoules today. My view is that the role of natural gas in our system will be far more enduring. As the global population continues to grow, especially in Asia, there is a maturing middle class with reasonable standard of living expectations, entirely reasonable. People expect their lights and appliances to switch on day or night. People expect to have access to affordable food. People expect to maintain and indeed improve their living standards. And people expect to feel safe in their nation, confident that national security and energy security is not compromised. Natural gas is a key enabler to all these things. And the fact is that technologies are just not there yet to replace it in many applications. And so I expect natural gas will be around for a long, long time to come. Continued demand for gas is undeniable. Absolutely undeniable in my view, but demand is just one side of the equation. It's the ability to supply that's really contested in Australia today. And thanks largely to government inaction and intervention, in a few short years, we will not have enough gas in Australia to supply to meet our needs. Like Groundhog Day, we've heard from the Australian Energy Market Operator repeated warnings for urgent investment in new supply. And like Groundhog Day, our government has buried their head in the sand, instead tying themselves in knots and our industry in a monumental knot of intervention. Thankfully, after some long and hard advocacy by industry and users alike, railing against last year's terrible interventionist policies in particular, and finally agreed that we do need continued investment in new gas supply. But now there needs to be action, not words. There has never been a more important time to get the policy settings right and bring more gas online, and quickly. Sadly, regardless of pace, more local supply, in my view, simply won't be enough to avoid these forecast shortfalls. We must also urgently invest in new infrastructure, new pipelines, a strategically positioned LNG import terminal in the southeast to get supply to where it is needed most, and importantly, when it is needed most. Now, while I've been up here reminding you about the importance of continued investment in fossil fuels like gas in our modern world, I'm certainly not suggesting we pick winners. There are no government handouts that the industry is asking for. The reality is we need all forms of energy to feed the insatiable demand that exists, to drive improved living standards and to enable our complex energy system transformation. It's about getting the balance right so we can continue to meet our societal expectations around energy being affordable and reliable, and at the same time, furthering environmental and net zero aspirations. Senex operates in a region of Queensland that has thriving solar and wind energy industries coexisting side by side our natural gas sector. And that's a great thing. It's a great thing. And I'm proud of the role Senex is playing in delivering more domestic gas to power our factories and bolster the East Coast energy grid. In 2022, Senex announced plans to invest more than $1 billion to boost our natural gas supply to the domestic market to more than 60 petajoules a year by the end of 2025. It's a material amount of gas and represents more than 10% of the entire East Coast energy demand. Despite the challenges presented by the federal government's unprecedented gas market intervention over the last 18 months, Senex continues to move forward with our expansion plans, and we are delivering what we promised. In fact, this expansion will be 75% complete by the end of this year. It will deliver sorely needed new gas supply to a mix of manufacturing and energy retail customers alike through long-term gas sale agreements until at least 2035. Our gas will power Australian customers like CSR, who make plasterboard and bricks, One Steel and BlueScope, important Australian steelmakers, Aurora, who make glass bottles and packaging, and energy retailers including AGL, Engie and Energy Australia, who provide houses and businesses with the gas they need to keep running. The 151 petajoules from just these gas sales agreements equate to enough gas for almost 6.5 million households in a single year. And that's just the beginning of our supply commitments. Importantly too, this expansion will mean a further $200 million invested in the Maranoa and Western Down regions in Western Queensland. Senex is playing its part in delivering essential energy that Australia and the world needs. Something that as CEO of Senex for the last 14 years, I'm very proud of. Most of my professional life has been spent building this company, and I'm so proud of the role we play in our society and what we've been able to deliver. It's extraordinarily fulfilling to see how far we've come from a small oil explorer with one employee to a gas producer supplying more than 10% of the entire East Coast. As Brian mentioned in his introduction, thanks Brian, I recently announced that I am stepping down as CEO of Senex. After a hard-fought battle to overcome government intervention, securing approvals and gas contracts, and getting our projects galloping, Senex is in the best position it has ever been in, with a clear runway and incredibly bright future. It's likely that this actually will be my final public address as CEO of Senex, and so it's fitting to be talking on a topic that I am so passionate about, and that I share with my successor and long-time Operations Chief, Darren Stevenson, who is here today. Do you want to stand up for a sec? Having worked with Darren now for more than a decade, I have full confidence he'll continue to drive Senex forward with the same passion to fulfil our purpose of delivering essential energy for life. So ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, just as energy has driven our progress and prosperity to now, it will continue to in the future. But how we choose to invest in energy and the policy settings our governments impose will define the path of our complex energy transformation. Australia is in the box seat to take advantage of opportunities this transformation can bring. We must continue to invest in stable, reliable and affordable energy, like gas, that has driven prosperity for centuries and the infrastructure to transport it to where and when it is needed most. And we must invest in new, low or no emission energies in a way that supports our economy, not works against it. Our resources have underpinned the economies and rising living standards in Australia and our neighbours and allies in Asia for over half a century. We are the lucky country, we are. But let's not forget that this lucky country is built on the back of resources. I will always be proud of the role our industry has and will continue to play in our prosperity as a nation. Everyone here and every Australian should be proud too. Thank you.